Hey, Dr. Mason, fellow students, I hope you're doing well. Here to present a presentation on my interview with Sam Allberry. Had a number of insightful and encouraging things happen in the context of this interview that I've really honestly lived with, some things that have brought deep gospel insight to my life and have not only transformed me in the context of this class and this presentation, but in my current ministry. I look forward to sharing those with you. If you look below you, hopefully you have a copy of the summary brief, 2 pages that will kind of outline where we're going. The first is just general information. Sam is a pastor. He's an author. He's a speaker. Gives his current ministry context. We'll talk about that in relationship to one of the questions I asked him below. Sam is most well known for his work, likely called Is God Anti-Gay? This is a book in the Questions Christian Ask series. Really, really helpful resource tool for us as pastors, and some great stuff that's gospel central in here that I really was able to see throughout his interview, my interview time with him and his character. Can see how he came up and God called him to write this book, and just how he came up with the things he did in it. Look, if you will, below in the summary brief to the questions and answers from the interview. The first I asked him was, what's your current ministry setting for worship and leadership? Sam is hopefully going to be an associate pastor at Emmanuel Church in Nashville. I know a number of us probably have familiarity with Emmanuel through Ray Ortland or TJ Timms, Barnabas Piper even. Sam is going to be a part of that staff, but he's waiting on his visa, so there's a little bit of a holdup there. It's the first time Emmanuel's ever had to apply for a work visa for someone outside the country, so that's the holdup, but that should be happening soon. He's also, if you flip over or look to the next page, a catechist and canon theologian serving the Western Gulf Coast Diocese of the Anglican Church in North America. That's another one of the things that he's doing right now. I asked him from the outset, what's your definition of leadership, and how has that changed or evolved over the years? He recognized that from an early standpoint, the norm was that leadership was those who command others, and has seen a lot of that in ministry, and he emphatically said, that's not me. He mentioned his relationship with Tim Keller, and Tim saying that some people lead through preaching, and that's the way that Sam views his leadership, that it's infusing and exciting others, and that he leads best when the Bible is open. At the core of Sam's heart, he wants the sheep to hear the voice of the good shepherd. And in this, he recognizes that that's his particular way that he leads, through preaching and teaching and writing, and that leadership doesn't mean that you lead in every single way. Instead, that it's a very specific call, and that his call is to bring people under the voice of Jesus. I asked Sam, when did you recognize that God gifted you to lead others? And he said he had this formative moment, this moment where this Anglican pastor and priest that really loved and shepherded him, in a moment when he was talking about his call with this priest, Bob Martin, that Bob actually took his priest collar off and placed it on Sam's neck. It was in that moment that the Lord began to really formatively work in Sam's heart to help him see that he would lead people by shepherding through the scriptures in a pastoral way. He mentioned Bob as one that consistently mentored him in his life, and not only mentored him personally, but turned him on to authors like Carson and Packer and Stott, these ministers who wrote so deeply, so clearly, and so eloquently, and that really informed his leadership in writing. When I asked him what he's learned about leadership development, he very clearly said that he learned from both good and bad examples, and that culture comes from character. He put a spotlight on the network that he was a part of back in England, and just some issues they were having, and how the cultures that there are being led by personality and prowess have gotten away from the reality that you're to lead through character, that it's paramount. He cited 1 Peter 5, 1 through 4 in what compels him to lead others. You can notice those portions of the verses below you that are italicized there, the care, the watching over them, the desire to serve willingly. It's that being an example, as Sam describes, is what calls him, it's what compels him to lead others. When I asked him to articulate how he believed that leaders are developed, he mentioned that there has to be an intentionality to commend others to a particular way, that's what springs up within a leader. It's this vision, it's this desire to see others follow Christ. And then he said this phrase that's really stuck with me. And I mentioned at the outset of this how this interview is not just formative for a moment, but I've been thinking on, chewing on, meditating on things that he said for weeks, and this is one of them. He said that gifting is necessary, but that it is not sufficient. And what he meant by that was he kind of articulated to or described leaders that we know that have risen to prominence, rather. Ravi Zacharias, who he had a relationship with, obviously, and then left that ministry because of the scandal. Obviously, Driscoll and others, people that led with personality and prowess and those type of things that were just inordinately gifted. But that gifting is not enough. The character of Christ, the love of God, the desire to serve and put oneself beneath others is ultimately what truly forms and develops leaders. I asked him finally if you could have one leadership book on your shelf, just one, what would it be? And he described the immense amount of importance that Letters Along the Way by D.A. Carson and John Woodbridge has meant to him. It's this writing back and forth of a senior pastor to a junior pastor, really helpful for the Christian life, but also for those of us who are in vocational ministry to walk through ministry as a number of questions are answered by one that's in leadership and mentoring. I thought that was an incredible reference, especially for us in leadership. In the conclusion portion that you see beneath you, you can see three distinct things. One is coming soon is this podcast that Sam has done with Ray Ortlund that they've produced and written that's coming out in August. It's called You're Not Crazy, Gospel Sanity for Young Pastors. In telling me about this, Sam was describing his desire for young pastors to continually be gospel-centered, and not driven by the things of the church, but the one thing that the church is called to is gospel reconciliation. So that was really, really encouraging. The second thing on there says, I would start at the center and work outward, then start at the edge and work in. That's a quote that's directly from his work, Is God Anti-Gay? And he describes a scenario when a gay couple comes to a church. This will happen to all of us, I would imagine, in our time in ministry. And he describes how to handle that situation, and this is what he says, that he would start at the center and work outward, rather than start at the edge and work in. And he says this, the center is the death and resurrection of Christ. That is where God reveals himself most fully. So that issue is not to be dealt with as an issue in isolation, but instead to get to the heart of the gospel with people and then let the edges move toward the center. And then finally, that last quote there, I want to spend time with Ray. He's referring to Ray Ortlund, the pastor that he's serving alongside with in Emmanuel, Nashville. He said this incredible thing. He says, he seems to be, speaking of Ray, to be getting more cheerful the older that he gets. That Ray's getting more cheerful the older he gets. Now, why is that? Sam just described how in working together and focusing on the gospel and ministering to people with one another, that Ray is finding continual joy. I think of the fact that we work, we are vocationally in a world where people leave a pastorate. They leave the ministry after 2 years. They leave the ministry after 3 years. But Sam's continual urge was if we're formed by the gospel, if we're transformed by the character of Christ, if our personal devotion will precede our professional development, then this will be characteristic of us as well. We'll be people who are more cheerful. My time with Sam was encouraging. I'm incredibly thankful for how lively he was in his desire to talk about the passion that he has for the gospel and just the realness of God's grace to him in Jesus Christ. I hope this has encouraged you and that in your leadership development, you'll look to Sam and his works for insight and encouragement.